Well, I'm delighted to be back here with you folks to talk to you. Many of you are good friends of mine and long-standing friends, so I'm really delighted to be here. Uh, I looked at the programs today and I said, well, enough of these pesky land battles. Time to get out on the water again. I'm just kidding. As the introduction said, I spend a lot of time in Galveston, and I do give an awful lot of battlefield tours, both at Galveston and Sabine Pass and Matagorda Bay and places like that. And occasionally I'm asked, why aren't there any national military parks for Civil War battles the way there are in other states? And my response is fairly simple. One, the Confederates won all the major battles here in Texas, so it doesn't really fit with the national narrative. But more seriously, one of the issues with trying to commemorate Texas Civil War battles is that almost all of them had a large component that took place out on the water. And it is particularly challenging to try to memorialize a battle that took place out on the water. And as it turns out, Texas is very unique in that virtually all of the major battles in Texas, with one possible exception that I'll talk about at the end, had a naval component. So again, the Civil War in Texas was unique to any other Confederate state. Although attacked many times from many different directions, Texas was more successful at defending its borders than any other Confederate state. As was said, I did write a book on Juneteenth and what actually happened in Galveston on that day, and it's very different than what the usual narrative is that you might find in the newspaper. But you kind of ask yourself, why is it that Galveston, Texas, on an exposed barrier island off the coast, ends up being the last major Confederate port anywhere? How does that happen? And why does that happen? Why isn't it taken earlier in the war? Why does it last so long? And the reason is the stories that I'm about to tell you of the naval campaigns that took place in Galveston. Well, not only in Galveston, but all along the Texas coast. At the end of the war, Galveston was the major Confederate port for blockade running. It's the last major Confederate port anywhere. And all the major battles involved a naval component. And in fact, some of the battles took place entirely out on the ocean, and one very important battle took place completely out of sight of land. So we're talking about a very unique experience versus anything else that you might associate with the Civil War. So I wanted to first, I'm going to go through the whole connection all along the war with the coast, but I'm going to be talking about a number of battles, and I want to just warn you up front. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on any of these battles, and the reason is that I've written books and could give entire presentations on almost any of these battles, but between Jeff Hunt and Don Frazier and I, we've covered all the battles and skirmishes in incredible detail. And I wanted to kind of talk about the highlights of some of these things and maybe emphasize some things that you might not have put together because they're all very different. The first thing is we talk about the first shots of the Civil War being fired usually from Fort Sumter, April 12th of 1861. But as Joe pointed out earlier, the action involving Texas was actually much earlier. But there are connections with all of the things that you could argue were the first shots of the Civil War with Texas, and I just wanted to walk through that. Of course, we know Fort Sumter, the firing on it, April 12th of 1861. In command of Fort Sumter was Major Robert Anderson. What you may not know is that before the war, Robert Anderson was serving as the superintendent of ironworks up in New Jersey, in Trenton, New Jersey. And in that connection, he was involved with the ironwork that would eventually go on Galveston's Custom House. And if you go there today, to the corner of 20th and Post Office, this is the first building that the federal government ever built in Texas of a non-military sort. It's a beautiful building, and the ironwork is still there that Major Anderson supervised, and it still says USA up on the top of all those beautiful pediments. But the truth is that building was delivered literally on the eve of the Civil War, and in fact, its first use wasn't as a United States courthouse, custom house, and post office. Its first use was as a Confederate office building. So that's an interesting connection with Fort Sumter, but actually the connection goes back even before that. As Joe mentioned, the Star of the West is an interesting thing that most people in Texas don't really understand. You see a drawing of it on the right there. It was built in 1852 for Commodore Charles Vanderbilt. It's an 1,172-ton luxury sidewheel steamer. Now, this is not a warship. This is designed basically as a transport, a luxury thing like a cruise ship to take people from places like New York to New Orleans, to places in Mexico, to places in South America. It was designed for long-haul passenger luxury service. But when the war broke out, Vanderbilt agreed to charter it to the U.S. government for $1,250 per day, and the first use it gets is very interesting because it leaves New York on January 5th for what is advertised to be just a routine voyage to New Orleans. Everybody knew that was just a fiction. What was happening was the Star of the West was delivering fresh troops and supplies to the garrison at Fort Sumter. And word got back to the people in Charleston that the Star of the West was headed their way. And so they decided this could not be allowed to happen. They couldn't allow Fort Sumter to be resupplied. So on January the 9th of 1861, now remember this is 3 months before the Fort Sumter firing, the Star of the West starts approaching Fort Sumter. And on Cummins Point, there is a battery that is manned by some of the cadets from the Citadel School, and they actually fire shots at the Star of the West and drive it away. So many people argue that these shots from the cadets are actually technically the first shots of the Civil War. So why do I mention that? What possible connection could this weird vessel, this passenger vessel, have with Texas? Well, it turns out that what's going to happen next after this trip is that in Texas, a new commander arrives on the field. And when he arrives, it's Colonel Earl Van Dorn, and here's a painting of him. And he shows up in Texas in March of 1861. Now, a lot of things are happening in Texas in the spring of 1861. And the first thing is that the federal troops that are basically are being coordinated and centered around San Antonio are preparing to leave the state. And so they decide that they're going to march down to the Texas coast and take ships back to the north where they will then resume their place in the newly being formed and expanded Union Army. The Confederates know that they are coming. They know this is a threat, and they decide to stop it, and Earl Van Dorn is just the man to do this. He recruits a body of men, largely in Galveston saloons, and that is probably how George Bernard and his group got involved in this particular environment, because that is in fact where a lot of these people came from. And these people, a lot of these people would ultimately be serving with Dick Dowling as well later on in the war. So what happens is the Star of the West is chartered to evacuate the federal troops from Texas. It goes down to Matagorda Bay. It is positioned off the coast at Matagorda Bay, waiting for the troops to be ferried out. It's a very stormy night. They don't know exactly how many are coming or when they're coming. And Van Dorn knows that these troops are coming, and he recruits the force to go out from the saloons and prevent the Union force from escaping. So on April 17th of 1861, during a gale, the steamer General Rusk steams up slowly to the Star of the West. And in response to a hail, the ship responds that it is there to deliver some troops. And then they seize control of the ship. And this is probably the first large capture of a federal ship in the entire Civil War. The third thing that you might argue is the first naval shot of the Civil War happens at Charleston, April 11th of 1861. And this involves the famous steamer Harriet Lane. The Harriet Lane is trying to help protect the garrison at Fort Sumter and keep it from being eaten up, but they do not succeed in doing it. When a Confederate ship comes out of the harbor, Harriet Lane will fire a shot at it, and this is usually considered to be the first shot of the Civil War from a naval standpoint. That ship, of course, will be captured at Galveston Harbor in the Battle of Galveston Bay that we're going to talk about later. So let's get down to what's actually happening in Texas once the war starts. The first thing that happens is the USS South Carolina arrives to blockade Galveston on July the 2nd of 1861. And here's a drawing of it at Galveston. Now, the first thing that the South Carolina will do is try to add to its numbers by capturing a number of small ships to help it in its operations, to serve basically as tenders. And one of the first ships they capture is a schooner called the George G. Baker. And I think this is possibly the unluckiest capture ever, because a guy named William Abbott is placed as prize master in charge of sailing it up north to a prize court. And on August the 8th, off of 1861, again, he thought he was getting the greatest job in the world, because you get off of the federal blockade, you get onto this prize ship, you're suddenly in command of your own ship, you get to sail it up north. This is going to be great. You'll sail it up north, you'll take it into a federal port, you'll get money for the prize. This is the best job you could ever get. Unfortunately, it takes a month, and he gets up off of Hatteras, North Carolina, where he is recaptured by the Confederate privateer York. Now that's bad enough to have the ship that you're the prize master of captured by a Confederate privateer. But then, as they transfer Abbott and his men to the York, and they're heading into port with this recaptured ship, and the Union blockaders see them and start chasing them, and they start firing at Abbott and the men on this Confederate privateer. The Confederates decide there's nothing to do but basically go ashore and drive it ashore and then set it on fire. And Abbott and his men get off there. Some of them are wounded, and they end up in a Richmond prison for a large part of the rest of the war. So this is probably the unluckiest capture of the entire war, as far as I can tell. So about a month after the South Carolina arrives in Galveston, we have the first serious skirmish in Civil War Texas on August the 3rd of 1861, and that's what this particular engraving is designed to commemorate. The South Carolina is off the coast and sends a couple of its tenders regularly, fairly close to the shore, to patrol and make sure the Confederates are not doing anything they need to take notice of. The Confederates on the beach in a fort there, the old South Battery, which is about where the Galvez Hotel is today, decide that, they haven't had really any good target practice in a while, and this might be fun. So they launch a few shots in the morning at these little tenders. They don't hit anything. They're not even close to hitting anything, but it infuriates the captain of the South Carolina. And he decides to retaliate. And so in the afternoon, he brings the South Carolina within pretty good close range to the Confederate fort on the beach and starts to bombard the fort. Now, what has happened is, because of the action in the morning, people in Galveston know this is coming. And they decide, kind of like the people at Manassas, that, just for novelty, let's go to the beach with picnic lunch, bring some stuff with us, and let's watch the battle. We'll sit on the beach and watch the battle take place. What they don't realize is that this is early in the war, and the gunners on both sides are completely incapable of hitting their targets and really have no idea where they're firing. And so the firing is extremely wild. The Confederates don't strike the South Carolina at all, and after a fairly significant bombardment, the only casualty ends up being a Portuguese man who had come to the beach to sell sandwiches to the picnickers that are watching the battle. So people at Galveston learned that you really don't want to watch an artillery bombardment from close range. And it's a lesson they will carry with them the rest of the war. So the next battle, and this is really the first significant battle, I think, in Texas, is at Corpus Christi, August 16th through 18th of 1862. It's a 3-day battle, but the day in the middle really doesn't count for much. August 13th, Lieutenant John W. Kittredge is refused access to the federal building by Major Alfred Hobby, and a 48-hour truce is agreed to so that the civilians can be evacuated. The truce expires, but there is no bombardment at the end of the 48 hours. So the Federals think, well, okay, we're just going to wait till the next day. During the night, Hobby moves his battery down to an old Mexican war fort right on the beach. And so when dawn comes, he opens fire on the startled Federals, who exchange fire with him and then back up because they're not prepared for a bombardment at this range. After several hours of relatively ineffective fire from both sides, the Federals retreat. The next day, they land 32 sailors with a howitzer who advance toward the Confederate fort. And about 600 yards from the fort, the Texans launched a successful cavalry charge. And in this painting, you can see, here's the Confederate fort here. Here's the Union sailors marching up here, and here's cavalry coming that's going to chase them up. So this is really the first successful cavalry charge in Texas of the war. The really first serious capture in Texas is Galveston Harbor, and it happens on October the 4th of 1862. Now, this drawing right here is by the Union naval surgeon on board the USS Clifton. And you'll see a number of these hand-drawn drawings I have of Texas battles and things. These are all from my third book, The Southern Journey of a Civil War Marine. And this guy, Dr. Daniel Nestel, who drew 85 different incredibly detailed pictures of the action, and they accompany a Union Marine's diary that accompanies this. But this is the entry of the Federal fleet into Galveston Harbor. The Confederates offer no resistance at all. They've been told to evacuate the island and just basically give it over to the Federals. And that's what happens. So Galveston has fallen into Union hands at this point. And so Commodore William Renshaw, who's in charge of the Federal fleet, decides he's going to expand his base of operations. And so he goes down and bombards Port Lavaca on October the 31st and November the 1st of 1862. And this is the only drawing we have of the Battle of Port Lavaca. And it's a really interesting one. You can see on the left the USS Clifton, and on the right the USS Westfield. Both of these boats are converted Staten Island ferry boats that have been made into gunboats, and they demand the surrender of Port Lavaca and are told in no uncertain terms that the artillery garrison there will not surrender, and they decide to bombard the city of Port Lavaca after a short period to evacuate civilians. Both sides will exchange fire. Again, there's very little damage done to the Federal ships at all. There's some damage to the city of Port Lavaca, but not a whole bunch. October 31st will pass, November 1st will come, and the Federals will again resume the bombardment, at which point this happens. The 100-pounder gun on board Westfield blows up. And a 100-pounder gun is a gun that fires a projectile that weighs 100 pounds. So it's a big gun. And when these guns blow up, they normally kill a lot of people, but the Westfield is lucky. No one on board the ship is killed in this action. This drawing is from another explosion of a 100-pounder gun, the Juniata in 1864, which had very serious casualties, just to give you an idea of what that was. So why do I mention the Battle of Port Lavaca? The Battle of Port Lavaca, in some ways, may have more long-term consequences for the Civil War than any other battle in Texas. And that may be a strange thing for me to say initially, but let me tell you why. Because sitting in the audience, basically, in the city of Port Lavaca was a man named Edgar Collins Singer. And Singer was a gunsmith, and he was a very clever guy, and he was really mad that the Federal fleet had come to his city and bombarded his city. And he thought there has to be a way to get rid of these big Federal gunships and keep them from doing this. So he started experimenting with some exploding gunpowder projectile containers in a barrel of water behind his house. And he developed what he thought was a very effective floating torpedo, basically what we would call a mine today. And he demonstrated its effectiveness. General Magruder in Houston decided it was so effective, he would send him on to the rest of the Confederacy. And this little band of men that Singer and his group recruited there around Port Lavaca would end up having amazing consequences for the Civil War. They used the torpedoes that they had to destroy any number of Union vessels, including a very large number of Union ironclads. These men would end up owning 2/3 of the Confederate submarine Hunley in Charleston. You may not know that. They would have torpedoes and place them that would blow up the Eastport on the Red River. They would put the torpedoes in that would so frustrate Admiral Farragut in August of 1864 when he entered Mobile Bay. When Farragut is riding into Mobile Bay and says, "Damn the torpedoes," He's damning the Texas torpedoes because they were all built by Texans, this little group of men from Port Lavaca, and placed by them at the entrance to Mobile Bay. And of course, during that action, the giant ironclad, the Tecumseh, would blow up and sink in minutes, one of the really, truly catastrophic losses in Union naval power for the war. And just for the record, the Texans get even because in February of 1865, one of the ships that the Texas torpedoes will manage to sink is the USS Osage, which is the one that Don mentioned today as being responsible for the death of the hero Tom Green. So the Texans do get even. But this little band of men from Port Lavaca end up destroying more Union Navy ships than the entire Confederate Army and the entire Confederate Navy combined. And it all comes about because he was sitting there and mad in Port Lavaca when this little battle was taking place in October of 1862. It's an amazing story. Okay, so at this point, they didn't capture Corpus Christi, but the Union has control of the entrance to Corpus Christi Bay. They didn't capture Port Lavaca, but they basically have control of the entrance to Matagorda Bay. They have control of the entrance to Sabine Pass, and in fact, at one point, they actually have control of the fort at the entrance to Sabine Pass. So everything is going their way in the fall of 1862. And so Admiral Farragut writes one of the worst timed telegraphs in the entire Civil War. And he says, all we want is a few soldiers to hold the places, and we will soon have the whole coast. That is October of 1862. Things were going to change really abruptly, and I call it the 3 battles in 3 weeks. By the end of January of 1863, he summed up the operations in Texas as nothing but disaster. And in fact, things got so bad that the people in Washington didn't even need to open the dispatches coming from Texas because they knew that the first line would include the word disaster in it. It was really, really bad. And Farragut would describe one of these actions that I'm about to tell you about as the most shameful incident in the entire history of the United States Navy, and it's certainly arguable that it was. So we'll talk about the Battle of Galveston on January the 1st of 1863. And by the way, if some of you are interested, I lead walking tours connected with the Battle of Galveston every January, and I'll be doing it again this January on January 6th and 7th. As a volunteer for the Galveston Historical Foundation. We do a walking tour that includes the sites on the Battle of Galveston. We walk down the Strand, and we walk actually by a building that doesn't even have a historical marker now, but this is the building where Company L of the 1st Texas actually drilled before they were sent up to join Lee's army. And we end at the Juneteenth marker. So we'll do walking tours and probably at least one driving tour of the city of Galveston, where we'll drive by a number of sites, including the homes of a couple of Hood's veterans. So if you can join us, be sure to do so. So this is an eyewitness drawing of the Battle of Galveston from the Union perspective of January the 1st of 1863. I won't go into the entire detailed story of the Battle of Galveston, but you should know that there are Union ships in the harbor that a number of Union gunboats, the same ones we saw before, particularly the Westfield, the Clifton, and the Harriet Lane, are out in the harbor. And the Confederates now have a new champion in the form of General John Bankhead Magruder, Prince John as he's known in the old Army. And Prince John will actually launch one of the craziest and most audacious battle plans of the entire Civil War. The idea is that he's going to bring over guns during the middle of the night and bring them over to the waterfront, fire them out at the Union ships at around midnight, and then, while the Union is occupied dealing with this bombardment, his ships will come along behind the Union fleet and just sweep them out of the harbor. Now, when I say ships, we don't have any Confederate naval vessels in the area at all. What we do have are a number of paddle wheel steamboats that were designed to take cotton, mainly from Houston down to Galveston and the areas around it. And they decide to convert those into gunboats by putting cotton bales along the decks and putting sharpshooters on those vessels and maybe a couple of small cannons in the bows of those vessels. So these would be called the cottonclads. And this identifies the moment when the Federal fleet is basically being bombarded from the shore and the Confederate cottonclad forces are coming from the rear. I said that this is a naval force, and it really is for the most part. There are about 250 men from the 42nd Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. These men had arrived basically on Christmas Eve of 1862, and they were waiting for the rest of their regiment, which had gotten separated on a bunch of other ships and unfortunately didn't arrive in time. So in the meantime, the colonel of the regiment, Colonel Isaac Burrell, decided to put his men out on the end of a wharf. And the wharf is known as Kuhn's Wharf, K-U-H-N. And we're really lucky because somebody went up to the top of the Henley building, which still stands today, and took a photograph of Kuhn's Wharf. And you can see it. It's a big long thing here that goes out to the end and has a triangular landing area out at the end there with a big 3-story warehouse at it. And what Colonel Burrell and his Massachusetts men do is they take up all of the planks on the wharf except for one plank, so that you have to basically tiptoe down this one plank to get to them. And that will prevent any kind of enemy charge at them, and they're safe at the end of the wharf. They need to be safe because the Massachusetts force consists of only 3 companies. And as it turns out, the 3 companies that arrived in Galveston in time used different kinds of ammunition. And 2 of the 3 companies arrived on a ship that did not include the ammunition for their particular weapons. So they have nothing to fire at the enemy, and they are located at the end of this wharf. Now, General Magruder, during this big bombardment that's coming from the shore, Magruder has a plan for dealing with these pesky Massachusetts troops at the end of the wharf. And what they're going to do is wade out on either side of the wharf. And they have about 500 men. Then they're carrying ladders, scaling ladders with them. And the idea is that they're going to go out into the deep water. They're going to put down the ladders, mount the wharf in back of the Massachusetts troops, and attack them from the rear. It is an excellent plan. Unfortunately, they didn't get a chance to really test this out in advance. And when they got out to the place where they're going to deploy the ladders, they put the ladders in and they sunk down in the ooze, that is Galveston Bay, and they could not reach the tops of the wharf. So they throw away the ladders in disgust, wade back to shore, and this is when a significant number of the casualties for the Confederates happened during the Battle of Galveston. So the only large wading charge, as far as I know, of the Civil War happens in the Battle of Galveston and is a complete and utter failure. Meanwhile, the cottonclads have finally arrived in sight. They've been in sight earlier, but since the Confederate land force was late in getting to the waterfront, they didn't actually launch their attack. But finally, about 5 o'clock, when the Confederates do start firing from the shore, the forces of the cottonclads will resume their attack and come in sight of the Federal fleet. And as Don pointed out earlier, in charge of the Federal fleet is a man called Leon Smith. It's Leon the Lion Smith, we call him, who was a steely-eyed guy, and he was determined to go ahead and attack the Federal fleet. And this was despite the fact that early on in the battle, even before the battle had commenced, the Confederate gunners in the bow of the Bayou City, which is one of the 2 ships, had fired their gun, and when it fired, it exploded, killing the entire Confederate gun crew in the bow of the Bayou City, which was the biggest gun the Confederates had. They decided to continue the attack anyway. And plan B was that the 2 Confederate ships, the Bayou City and the Neptune No. 2, were going to ram a Union ship from opposite sides, because most of these ships had paddle wheels on their sides. And if you go in through the paddle wheel, you could disable a Union ship and send over sharpshooters behind the cotton bales to act as boarders onto the Union ship. So that's plan B. And you can imagine that was sort of a daunting task to these poor men that are behind the cotton bales on top of those cotton-clad ships. And the first ship they will encounter is the USS Harriet Lane, and this is a drawing by the naval surgeon on the Clifton of the capture of the Harriet Lane. And it took some time and a couple of attempts, but eventually the Bayou City rammed the Harriet Lane in exactly the right place. The boarders went over, and the USS Harriet Lane had suddenly become the CSS Confederate Harriet Lane. Unfortunately, in this contest, while this was all happening, the anchor of the Harriet Lane deployed. And so the Bayou City and the Harriet Lane are basically sitting perpendicular to one another with the Harriet Lane anchored. The other ship, the Neptune, had really rammed the Harriet Lane substantially hardly, but unfortunately it stove in the bow of the Confederate ship, which then proceeded over to the side of Galveston, very close to where the cruise terminal is today, and sank. So Leon Smith now has a sunken ship and a ship that's welded to a Federal ship in a position that it cannot move at all. What do you do if you're Leon Smith? He sends over a boat to the rest of the Federal fleet and demands their immediate and complete surrender. And a truce is granted to consider this absolutely crazy and remarkable demand. Why is it that this truce is seriously considered? Here's an actual painting that we have of the Bayou City ramming the Harriet Lane. It's a beautiful painting of that encounter there. Again, it's almost dawn, but not entirely. Well, because earlier in the evening, the USS Westfield, which was Commodore Renshaw's flagship, had seen a light in the distance. What they had probably seen was the Confederate ships which were coming down from the northern part of Galveston Bay, and they went off to investigate it. And they didn't know the channels around Galveston very well. It's in the middle of the night, and they managed to run aground near Pelican Spit, which is kind of out over where Pelican Island is today. And so while all the things I've been describing to you were going on, weighting charges, bombardments, ramming attempts, all this is going on, the Westfield is frantically trying to get off this sandbar, and they cannot get it off. And so the Commodore has basically no way of directing the action. Finally, a boat comes up and says, "Commodore, you might want to know they've demanded our immediate and complete surrender, and we probably think we ought to do it." And Renshaw is furious about this. He decides that there's only one thing to do. He needs to order all of his ships to leave Galveston Harbor where they can regroup and figure out something to do that makes better sense. And he decides to blow up the Westfield to keep it out of Confederate hands, his flagship. And they leave a trail of powder to the side, put all the powder around the boilers, and make what they call a slow match to make sure that they light it as they're leaving the ship, and it will then blow up. Unfortunately, the slow match is not as slow as Commodore Renshaw needs it to be. The Westfield explodes, killing him and a dozen members of his crew. And what's left of the Union fleet steams out of Galveston Harbor, still flying the white flag of truce. It's a bizarre thing. The Battle of Galveston has ended in a complete and utter Confederate victory that the Confederates had no reason to expect would be successful. So I want to pause here to tell you about some things that are kind of interesting. These were not in the original book. This is all new stuff. What happened is in the early 2000s, a project was launched by the Corps of Engineers to widen the channels in Texas City. And in the course of doing that, you have to do some investigations of what's down there that could be impacted by the proposed project. And they got down there and they said, "Boy, there's a lot of iron down there. There's a lot of magnetic stuff down there. Wonder what that is." Well, we had a pretty good idea. We knew what it was. We assumed it probably was the USS Westfield. And in fact, that's what it turned out to be. But what was interesting was they had to go ahead with this project. There was no question about that. And so as a result, the Westfield wreck became the site of the largest salvage project in Texas history. And the Corps of Engineers paid for several $1 million to salvage what was left of the Westfield and conserve the 8,000 artifacts that came off of the Westfield. Now, as they point out in the introduction, I serve as a voluntary Marine steward for the Texas Historical Commission. I don't do any diving anymore. My main contribution is adding to the historical side of if and when something is found, what it might be. And I'll tell you Ed's 3 rules for shipwrecks when I'm contacted about one. The first rule is, if they find a shipwreck, it's likely you will never figure out what that ship is. That's highly likely. The second thing is, if you figure out what ship it is, it will not be an important ship. It'll be something minor that you just will be sorry you almost found, right? The third thing is, if you find a ship and it's an important ship, you really won't have much information to contribute on it, because all you're really going to have is a couple of letters, or maybe a report, and whatever you get from the excavation. You won't have anything significant about the wreck of a ship you find. All 3 of those rules were completely violated with the wreck of the USS Westfield. And the reason is, and this is just dumb luck on our part, I happened to find in the Memphis, Tennessee Public Library an incredibly detailed drawing of the USS Westfield made at Galveston 1 week before the Battle of Galveston. And you can see it here. And the picture doesn't do it justice. It's large, it's incredibly scaled and detailed, and you can actually see the iron rivets on the armor on the side of Westfield. You just never have that sort of detailed information when you're finding a shipwreck, but we do on Westfield. And we were real interested to see what these artifacts were going to tell us. And I point to that one thing in the front. Of course, that's a gun. And we were delighted to pull up a 9-inch Dahlgren from the wreck of the Westfield. This is just me the day after it's brought up, and you can see it's on memory foam mattresses. It's going to make its journey to Texas A&M, to the Conservation Research Lab, where it will be conserved. There's a 9-inch Dahlgren photograph on the left, just showing you how such a gun might be displayed. I was really interested to see the gun. The Confederates salvaged all the guns. They thought they'd salvaged every gun that the Westfield had. What they didn't realize was, because the 100-pounder had blown up, Westfield had actually on it another gun that was not part of its original complement. And so that gun went unsalvaged, and we were lucky enough to find it during the excavation. Here it is. It's still a little rough shape. The conservation people have gotten some of the stuff off it. This would lay in a chemical bath for years there at Texas A&M. And finally, it would be moved into Texas City Museum, where it is now part of an exhibit. And if you haven't been, and I know many of you probably haven't been, make a point to go see the Texas City Museum. The Westfield exhibit is one of the best Civil War gunboat exhibits in the entire country. It's amazing what we found. And it's not just the gun, it's a whole bunch of armor and the boiler machinery, personal artifacts. It's an amazing thing. So, again, I was delighted to see the gun, but you might be surprised to see that I was really more excited about something else. And the something else was the armor on the side, because we kept hearing about these gunboats being described as ironclads. And we knew they had some iron armor, but we knew it couldn't be like the Monitor or something of that size, because that would make these things way too heavy, and they couldn't possibly enter Galveston Bay. But we really wanted to see one of these armor plates. So I was really delighted to see one of these things. And according to my drawing, these things were supposed to be 5 foot by 5 foot exactly. And I was there and lucky enough to be there when we pulled the first one up. Now, let me explain to you a little bit about how these plates work. So Westfield had iron plates on the side, but again, it's a ferry boat. So they have the front and the back have these low keel supports there, and they're basically flat to allow cargo to come on and off the boat. And the way they armored these things was by putting the guns up there on the various sides, and then they had folding armor with leather hinges that went up and down to protect the guns. And this is not one of like the Westfield or Clifton. This is another ferry boat that's converted into gunboat, and you can see the folding armor here that would go up on either side of the guns, and the guns would point through these holes. So I was really delighted to see when they finally pulled one of those things up. And here's the first one, and we measured the sucker, and it was 5 foot by 5 foot, just like the drawing. And boy, I felt good when that came up, And they brought it over. We sent it to the lab to be conserved there, and it's a big thing. But again, I wanted to see how thick it was. How effective could this thing have been? And it turns out it's basically what we call boilerplate. It's less than an inch thick, even counting for it lost some mass during its long bath there in the waters of Galveston Bay. But even counting for that, this stuff was very, very thin. It would have stopped musket shots or something like that, but any serious piece of ordnance would definitely have penetrated the sides of these iron armored gunboats. So that's the end of the Battle of Galveston. But again, go see the Texas City Museum if you get a chance. Now, if this is all that had happened, Galveston would have been recaptured immediately, because when Admiral Farragut heard what had happened in Galveston, he was horrified. Again, it was the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to the U.S. Navy. He sent a very large force of gunboats to the entrance of Galveston Bay, and their instructions were to take Galveston back as soon as possible. And they were in the process of preparing to do so. This is January 11th, 10 days after the Battle of Galveston. They're preparing to do so when out in the distance, literally out of the blue, a ship comes in sight of the Federal fleet. And they don't know what it is. It's what they call a strange sail. And so Commodore Bell, who's in charge of the Union operation, will send a ship out, the USS Hatteras, to see what this strange sail is. And the strange sail will then take off and head out to sea, and the Hatteras will chase and chase and chase. And they're getting in close to this strange sail. They can see now that it's not just a sailing ship, it's a steamer, and they're wondering what is happening here. And then all of a sudden, the strange sail stops. Now, if you're a Union blockader and a ship stops, that is a surprise to you. That is something that doesn't happen. Either they run from you or they do something else. They certainly don't stop and turn around and start sailing back for you. And that's what this ship was doing. And as it turned out, the strange sail that the Hatteras was chasing turned out to be the Confederate commerce raider Alabama. And nobody in the Union fleet thought the Alabama was within 1,000 miles of Galveston. They were completely shocked by this. And so there's an exchange of communications. What ship is that? And at first, Raphael Sims on board the Alabama does the standard thing and says, no, we're the British ship, the Petrel, or there's the Vixen. There are a couple of names that people say he gave. But then he said, no, tell them who we are and then fire a broadside. They yelled, we are the Confederate raider Alabama, and launched a broadside. And in a battle that only took about 13 minutes, the Alabama disabled the Hatteras, and the ship proceeded to sink. And this is my friend Andy Hall did some amazing drawings of the battle. The ship on the top, the red, is the Alabama, and the ship on the bottom, the blue, is the Hatteras. Now, what's interesting about this is Hatteras had an iron hull. Now, it was kind of like the armor on the Westfield. It wasn't very thick, and it really wasn't designed as a warship originally. But you would have thought that would have given it some strength, but it didn't. Alabama's a superior gunners, superior artillery, and it really bombarded the Hatteras into nothing fairly quickly. Again, it sunk in 13 minutes. I believe this is probably the first iron-hulled warship ever to be sunk in warfare. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The Alabama would only fight 2 warships during the Civil War. This one, where it's successful, and of course it will be disabled and sunk by the Kearsarge off of France much later in the war. But the fact that they had such little trouble with the Hatteras here was probably one of the factors that led Raphael Sims to at least attempt to fight the Kearsarge later on with disastrous results. But Sims sails off with the crew of the Hatteras and takes them to Jamaica, and the Federal fleet will later sail out and see some of the masts from the sunken Hatteras sticking out of the water and realize what has happened, that some major Confederate ship has come out and sunk this ship, and they're shocked at this, and so they will hold off attacking Galveston until they can figure out what is happening, and they're worried about the Alabama coming back and doing it again. Now, point of fact, the Alabama is sailing to Jamaica, and very soon will not be within 1,000 miles of Galveston again. Galveston will be the closest Confederate port that the Alabama will ever come close to reaching. But that's the way it is. But it is a major drawback to the Union on the Confederate Texas coast. Just to show you some photographs, we went out to the wreck of the Hatteras and did some elaborate laser 3D reconstructions of the wreck. It's in pretty good shape here. You can see my friend Jessica Anselmo does some amazing underwater photography. This is unrepresentative of the visibility out there. It was almost impossible to see anything on 2 of the days we were out there, but he did get a couple of pictures. This is the paddle wheel. The spokes are gone, but you can see the revolving mechanism there. Here's another couple of photographs. The triggerfish out there were just brutal on the divers we had deployed and stuff. Now, again, as a historian, you're always wondering, well, how's the stuff we have going to measure up with the real thing? On the top is a drawing that one of the artists for Harper's Weekly had done of the sinking of the Hatteras. Now, he'd not been on the Hatteras when this happened, and you got to figure, well, this can't be at all accurate. And I was very skeptical that it would look like that. And then we got back the 3D renderings of the vessel there, and you can see this is this is the stern of the vessel. These are the iron stakes going up that would hold the hull plate. This is the paddle wheel, and the thing that connects the paddle wheels there in the center with parts of the engine. We were real interested, and when we looked at it, the angle that the guy had drawn above was almost precisely the angle that the Hatteras was sitting on the seabed at, which was remarkable to us. It's about 30 miles off the coast of Galveston. So that would have been enough. Again, that held off the Federals for a while, but they probably would have come to and again resumed the attack on Galveston, except for one more wild, crazy thing. And that is the Confederates decided to use cotton clads again, but this time at Sabine Pass. General Magruder had said, we need another diversion. And he said, the cotton clads had proved their worth at Galveston. We could do it at Sabine Pass. He ordered, taking a couple of ships, the Uncle Ben and another one up there, and turning them into attack vessels. And so on the morning of January 21st, again, this is 20 days after the Battle of Galveston, 10 days after the Alabama captured Hatteras, they steam out of Sabine Pass and attack the Union blockaders, the Morning Light in particular there, the Velocity, are the blockaders off the coast of the Sabine Pass. And this is an interesting one because this is 2 steamships against sailing vessels. Now these steamships, these little packet steamers that are coming out of Sabine Pass as cotton clads, they're not really designed to operate in the open ocean, but they can maneuver pretty well. And it just turned out that, unfortunately for the Federals, the wind conditions were such that they couldn't really position themselves very well, and the Confederate steamers could get in the exact position they needed to deploy their rifle guns, one of which was under the command of Lieutenant Richard Dick Dowling, and disable the machinery or the operations equipment on board Morning Lights. They captured both of the blockaders off the entrance to Sabine Pass. So within 3 weeks, the Confederates have recaptured Galveston, sunk the Hatteras, and now it captured the entire Union blockading force off the entrance to Sabine Pass. This is a coast that Admiral Farragut had bragged about only a couple of months earlier. We could take the rest of it so easily. Now he was ashamed of the whole project. And the Union would hold off doing anything serious at Galveston for about 8 months. The next thing what occurred is, again, eventually they decide we have got to return to Texas. And Abraham Lincoln orders this from the top down. He says, we need to show the Union flag in Texas, mainly to deter the French who are operating in Mexico, possibly trying to get a puppet emperor, which turned out to be Maximilian, on the throne. And so Banks is ordered to show the Union flag in Texas. But he first says, well, he didn't say exactly which part of Texas I had to show the flag on. And, he says, I don't want to attack Galveston again. That has worked out so poorly for us. I don't want to go to Matagorda Bay. Fort Lavaca worked out very poorly for us. I could go down to Brownsville, but landing on a beach down there, that's just a terrible idea. That doesn't do anything for us. And he thought, if I could capture Galveston, that would really make my reputation. I could redeem my reputation if I could capture Galveston. And so he decides to launch what would eventually be called the Sabine Pass Expedition. Now, this is the map that Nathaniel Banks sent to President Lincoln to show him his plan of operations. And the plan was not really to do anything at Sabine Pass other than land. He was going to land an expedition that would eventually be as high as 15,000 men. But they only had about 5,000 men that they could accommodate on transports. So that force, plus about 4 Navy gunboats, was going to show up at Sabine Pass, disable the small Confederate fort there, land the troops, and then the troops were going to march up from Sabine City up to the railroad, which went basically the Louisiana border over here at Orange. They were going to march over on the railroad tracks as a line with a line of supply coming here and a line of supply coming there. They were going to capture Houston, which Houston was really not fortified the way Galveston was at this point. So it would have been an easy thing to do. And so they were going to attack Houston, capture it, which was basically the railroad network of Texas if you got Houston, and then they could cut off Galveston from the interior and basically take it whenever they wanted to. That was the plan. Unfortunately, they had not taken into account the fact that there was a small body of men under the command of a 26-year-old Irish saloon keeper named Lieutenant Richard William Dick Dowling, in command of a total of 41 men, including the officers. These men were all Irish dock workers from Galveston, Houston for the most part, and they had been in a fort there called Fort Griffin, and the fort had been cleverly designed by the Confederate engineers, and it was designed to take into account the topography of the region. We'll talk about that in a second. But on basically the night of September 7th, you end up having about 26 large ships off the entrance to Sabine Pass. And Dowling can look at those men, look at those ships and everything assembled with those binoculars, which are in the UDC collection in the museum in Fort Worth. And he looks out there and looks those ships assembling there, and people said it looked like New York City. There were so many lights out there on that night. Dowling's orders are, if you are faced with an overwhelming force, disable your guns and evacuate. Make sure the enemy doesn't get your guns, but just disable the guns and evacuate. And he looks out there and he sees all these ships with all these guns and all these men, and he looks at his small body of Irishmen, and he has to think to himself, this is an overwhelming force, if anything is. But Dowling does not want to evacuate. He and his men have practiced for months firing those guns. They put stakes out in the channel that they could hit with deadly accuracy. They've spent all this time doing it. They don't want to leave. And Dowling, he has a choice. He can order his men to stay, he can order his men to leave, or he can put it up to a vote. Now, no officer at West Point would put up to a vote a decision like that, right? But Dowling's not a West Point officer. He's an Irish saloon keeper, but he knows these men incredibly well. He's seen them at their best, and Lord knows he's seen them at their worst. And he decides to leave the decision to them. They vote unanimously that they're going to stay and fight, and Dowling will put in this official report that they decide that their official motto during the battle is victory or death. Those words, of course, come from William Barrett Travis's final letter from the Alamo, because these guys think those are the odds. They're definitely the odds that are facing them. In fact, they're actually longer odds than the garrison faced at the Alamo. But Dowling and his men are not going to leave. They're going to stay and fight. Now, again, just so you understand the geography a little bit, the Confederate fort had originally been closer to the entrance to Sabine Pass, but the engineers had moved it up to a little point that jutted out into the waters of Sabine Pass. You see a little jumping out point here. Up at the top, that's where the fort is. That's Fort Griffin right there. And there's an oyster shell reef that comes up in the middle of the water of Sabine Pass. And what that means is you can't go over it. So there's a pass on the east side, there's a pass on the west side. There's the Louisiana Channel on the east side, there's the Texas Channel on the west side. But notice where the fort is positioned. It's on that point jutting out in the water. And the fort is kind of a triangular shape, and its guns will point directly down those channels. And so any Union ships that are coming up those channels can really only direct their forward guns at the fort as they approach. And that's going to be a big problem for these ships. So the plan is that they're first going to send up the USS Sachem on the east side, the Louisiana Channel, and it's going to go up and fire at the Confederate fort. And while the Confederates are dealing with that force over in the Louisiana Channel, then the Clifton is going to go up the west side on the Texas Channel and make a direct approach to the fort and disable the fort. This is not a bad plan. And then, as a contingency, while all this is happening, while you have the Sachem in the Louisiana Channel, the Clifton in the Texas Channel, they're going to land about 500 soldiers under the command of General Godfrey Weitzel, and those men are going to march up and take the fort from the side. So they have a three-pronged attack. Unfortunately, that attack will go wrong almost immediately because, again, Dowling and his men have figured out exactly where their guns will fire. The Sachem starts going up the Louisiana Channel. They start firing at the Confederate fort, and what do the Confederates do? Nothing. Nothing at all. They're laying down behind the parapets, and the Federals start wondering, are they even there? And the reason is that Dowling has been told by the engineers, do not fire until they get to within the position of one of your stakes. Don't waste your ammunition. Save it for when it counts. And so while the Sachem is making its moves up there and firing at the Confederates, the pilot, who's actually a local man they've encountered for the time being, says, where those stakes are out there in the channel? And the captain sneers at him and says, nothing at all, don't worry about that. We're going to blow that pile of mud off that point there in just a moment. And then they reach the first of the stakes. And up pops Dowling and his gunners, and they start firing. Now, at first, things don't go really well. One of the howitzers, they only have 6 guns, and one of the howitzers recoils so badly that it falls off the parapet into the interior of the fort. So Dowling and his men are now down to 5 guns instead of the 6 they had before, and they were already outnumbered in terms of guns, probably 5 to 6 to 1. But they have these 5 guns, and they know how to fire them. And within a few shots, they start figuring out the range to the stake exactly, and they actually hit the Sachem exactly where they need to. It penetrates the boiler machinery. Superheated steam fills the ship and pours out onto the deck, and the sharpshooters start jumping overboard. The Sachem runs aground and is wedged into the Louisiana Channel and is completely disabled. So the Louisiana action happens and is over in a few minutes. That leaves Dowling and his men plenty of time to revolve their guns and direct it at the Clifton, which is now making its run up the Texas Channel. Now, this is an eyewitness drawing that does appear in one of the northern magazines, just to show you. This is the lighthouse on the Louisiana side that still stands today. This is the Sachem that is disabled in the channel here. Here's the Clifton approaching the Confederate fort out there on the port. And here are the various vessels that are approaching, because there are now all of these Union gunboat, these Union transports, and all the supplies for these 15,000 men that are coming. They're all pouring into the entrance of Sabine Pass and preparing, hoping that this pesky fort will be disabled and they can land and start the operation. They could not have been more wrong. The Sachem is out of action very quickly, and the Clifton will not be very far behind. Here's another drawing of the Clifton making its attack. The Confederates get very lucky on one of their early shots. One of their early shots severs the steering rope between the wheel and the rudder of the ship. That means that the Clifton then turns sideways and runs aground. Now, at first, this actually works to the advantage of the Clifton. Why is that? Because, again, we were talking about you could only fire the forward guns at the Confederate fort, so they couldn't really direct much fire there. Here's an actual eyewitness drawing of the Clifton done by the surgeon that's in the Civil War Marine book, and you can see where the guns are placed. And when the Clifton turns and runs aground, they now suddenly can fire almost a broadside at the Confederate fort. Unfortunately, they have run aground very close to one of the stakes out of the channel. And Dowling has been quickly figured this out and start pouring fire into the sides of the Clifton. One of the shots penetrates you saw the iron armor, it wouldn't stop anything. It went into the steam boiler machinery, superheated steam pours into the interior and the exterior of the ship. People start jumping overboard. They will wait for 45 minutes trying to fire and keep firing guns, at one point with a tomahawk, trying to keep the fire up, hoping that the Union Army will come and save them. But General Weitzel, who was under his orders obligated to land and attack the fort, decides, I don't think we want any part of that. He's seen how quickly they disabled the Sachem Louisiana Channel. He saw easily they disabled the Clifton. And he thinks, you know, walking over that muddy ground against this fort with those guys, I don't know what kind of anti-personnel, you know, canister or things like that they have in that fort, and I don't want to be any part of it. And so he refuses to land, and what's left of the Union expedition to capture Sabine Pass will start trying to make its way out of the entrance of Sabine Pass. And I say start trying because now the tide has gone down. And the entrance to Sabine Pass is very shallow, and the transports are going to have a hard time even getting over the sandbar to get out of Sabine Pass. They start frantically throwing things overboard. All the rations, all the mules, all the things they had brought to furnish this expedition go overboard, and supplies from this expedition will be coming ashore on Texas beaches for weeks to come. It will not be until this operation starts at 4 o'clock, and Dowling records on his watch that he's had his last shot fired at 45 minutes after the first shot. So this battle only takes 45 minutes, disables, completely captures these 2 Union gunboats, sent this entire Union expedition packing, and they will, it's an amazing victory. Jefferson Davis will later call this the most amazing victory in the entire course of military history. Now that may be overstating it a bit, but think about it this way. In terms of casualties and results, Dowling's men captured 2 Union warships, complete with all the men on board, including the sharpshooters and all the supplies they had. They sent the entire expedition packing. In fact, they had 300 prisoners. They didn't have enough men to even really guard the prisoners because they just didn't have the numbers. And what were the casualties on the Confederate side? 0. Not one man was even scratched during this battle. So in terms of results, I mean, this is a case where really David did capture Goliath, but it was very well handled, and it is really one of the amazing stories of Civil War history, particularly in Texas. So just to give you a little bit of information about the park and what's there today. This again is a drawing of the Clifton on the right, and you can see there's a kind of a diamond-shaped object up there at the top. Looks kind of like the pump on an oil well when you see an oil well pumping, and it actually functions pretty similarly. It's a piston that goes up and down with a rocker arm, and that rocker arm then moves a circular motion with some gears that move the paddle wheel. So it's an essential part of what's called a walking beam engine. And we took the walking beam of the Clifton, and it is actually at the battlefield today. If you hadn't been to the Sabine Pass battlefield in a while, we now have that out there with an interpretive panel. And it's really neat because it's one of the only battlefields in America where you can see where the fort was, and you can see a part of the ship that attacked it. And it's a neat display. In addition to that, they now have a model of the fort. Now this is a small model on the where the original fort was, that shows you where the ships were and what the fort looked like. And the fort was again sort of a triangular shaped thing with the 6 guns shown here. But it's a great display. If you haven't been to the battlefield in a long time, I urge you to go. I actually had the pleasure of taking Ed Bars to this battlefield and giving him a battlefield tour one time. He told me this was the only major battlefield in the United States that he had never attended. So that was kind of cool to get to take Ed to this battlefield. And he would have been delighted with what we've done with the battlefield now. And if you get a chance, do get a chance to go. It's great. It's the least visited Civil War battlefield in America, as far as I can tell. Okay, so now we've moved action because the Union still is under incredible pressure to do something to put the federal flag down in Texas. And so General Banks says, all right, I'm going to write off the entire eastern side of the Texas coast. Sabine Pass is a no-go. Galveston's no-go. Matagorda Bay is no-go. Maybe we can squeeze ashore somewhere down at the Rio Grande. And so he'll land down on basically Brazos, Santiago, down there where Elon Musk is firing rockets today. And he will raise the flag on that, send back a telegram to Abraham Lincoln saying the U.S. flag now fires proudly over Texas soil, and then he'll head back to New Orleans. And then they will launch an expedition that is, I think, one of the most ill-conceived expeditions in the entire Civil War. Somebody who obviously had never been to Texas, had no idea the scale of the place, must have conjured this expedition up. Because the idea was that they were going to land at the Rio Grande and then march up along the Texas coast, carrying their supplies and their artillery and everything with them, and they're going to get to Galveston Bay. Now think about how long a trip that is. And think about the country. You're going over all those little barrier islands which are not connected to one another. And you're going to have to haul that artillery along in that sand, and there's no supplies there. It's going to be a logistical nightmare. But Banks says, let's start that operation. And so they start that operation. And the people in Washington are just saying, what in the world is going on? And Grant is completely puzzled about this entire operation. But if you think about how this was proceeding, the Army is proceeding up along the coast on these barrier islands. They're carrying some small pieces of artillery with them, but they're not going to be able to carry anything substantial. So what that means is when they encounter a Confederate force, and particularly a Confederate fort, and there are a few on some of these islands, they're going to rely on the Union Navy gunboats as their artillery support. They're going to need the support the big guns the Navy has to have any impact on these Confederate forts. And so the first one that they'll capture Corpus Christi pretty easily. They're moving up Mustang Island. So on November the 17th of 1863, they face a fort that's called Fort Sims. Why is it called Fort Sims? Because of Raphael Sims and his capture of the Hatteras that we just saw not too long ago. And so at dawn on November 17th, a force of 1,500 Federals under the command of Thomas Ransom launched a surprise attack on the Confederate fort there. They are supported by USS Monongahela, shown here. Now, Monongahela has a 200-pounder Parrott rifle. Now, that's twice as big as the one the Westfield had that blew up. This is a big, big gun. And it doesn't take many shots from the Monongahela and the Federal artillery for the Confederates to decide, you know, it's time to quit this operation. We're going to get completely destroyed here. And the 100 Confederates promptly surrendered. They will then move up to Matagorda Bay, to Pass Caballo, which is shown here. And this is the fort that's at the entrance to Pass Caballo. It's called Fort Esperanza. And it looks in plan very similar to Fort Griffin over at Sabine Pass, but it has some added features. Because in 1863, the Singer Secret Service group, the people I told you about at Fort Lavaca, they planted a number of mines, torpedoes, at the entrance to Pass Caballo, and particularly the passes that led to their homes at Fort Lavaca. And as it became apparent at the end of 1863 that the Federals were going to march up the pass, Captain David Bradbury, who's one of the Singer group from Fort Lavaca, was ordered to take up every torpedo he had and convert them into landmines. And so he goes out into the ditch in front of this Confederate fort and buries these torpedoes as landmines with the lanyards going into the Confederate fort. And the idea is that when the Federals attack, the Confederates pull the lanyards, blow away up these men in these huge explosions. And that's the plan. Unfortunately, on November 29th, the Union landed a substantial contingent of infantry and artillery, and they're supported by the Union gunboats. They begin entrenching just like they did at Vicksburg, because a lot of these guys had come from Vicksburg, and they start systematically approaching the fort. The Confederates realize that they're outnumbered more than 3-1, and they face the fact that they're probably going to be cut off from the backside by troops that are moving up the side of the island. And so they finally decide on the night of the 29th that at 10 o'clock p.m., that they're going to blow up their magazines and evacuate the fort. The Union the next day takes command of the fort, and they're overjoyed to see that they have taken Fort Esperanza with very little casualties. And then one of the engineers who is supervising the fort and surveying it says, "What are those lines out there? The dead grass, what are those?" And he digs up one of them, and he sees that it's a wooden trench with a lanyard coming at it. And he starts following it to its end and digs it up, and there's this weird kind of a lamppost looking object there that he realizes is a torpedo. And he says, "Holy smokes, what have we got here?" And by the end, they'll dig them up. I think there were 24 of them in all. And these guys will be digging them up for months, but they will realize how absolutely lucky they were. The original Union plan had been to launch a direct assault on the Confederate fort. If they had done that, and the Confederates had actually exploded those landmines, this would have been the largest casualty event in the entire Civil War in Texas. No question about it. But because the gunboats were there and helped support it, drove the Confederates out, it ended up being a non-event. There would be landmines, by the way, put at Fort Griffin at Sabine Pass, but this is the closest we had to having a major landmine event in Texas. This is the attack on the 13th Maine by cavalry. They'll continue, again, marching up the coast, trying to get toward Texas. It's broken up by the USS Granite City and its gunboats on December the 29th of 1863. But by this time, this entire operation was winding down. The people in Washington said, this is not getting us anywhere. This is just silly. We need to quit this and do something that will really make a difference and help us in this war. Unfortunately, their decision is to take the men off the Texas coast, to send them into Louisiana, and to launch what would be an even more disastrous campaign, the Red River Campaign. And then we reach the last land battle of the war, the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, which Jeff has done a lot of work on. And I used to always come to this point in my talk and say, there's only one land battle in the Civil War in Texas, and every battle is a naval battle except for one battle, and it's this battle at Palmetto Ranch, and it's it's not close. It's a ways in from the Gulf of Mexico, so I can't count that. And then I found an account by a guy who said that during the battle that somebody had been on a rowboat and fired a shotgun at him. So another naval battle. So that's basically the end of the naval operations on the Texas coast. And because the Texans were so successful in defending the coast in this incredibly bizarre series of battles, some that are designed, some that happen luckily, some that happen absolutely fortuitously, Texas will end up at the end of the war basically untouched. And so at the end of the war, when things turn back, Galveston is ready to resume operations. Houston is ready to resume operations, and Texas really surges as part of the resounding South at this point. Thank you very much.